Welcome to Books on Air, the podcast that tells the story behind the book. It includes insights from authors about how they compose their work, what inspires them, and what they hope you'll take away from their book. Here's your host for this episode of Books on Air, Suzanne Harris.
Welcome to the Books on Air podcast. I'm Sloan Fremont, filling in for Suzanne Harris. This is a podcast where listeners get the secret story behind every book. Joining me today is Hugh Hyland. Hugh published his mother's book called The Forbidden Zone 1940. This book is a gripping account of a young Scottish lass caught up in the German occupation of France. So Hugh, I want to welcome you to the Books on Air podcast.
Yes, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yes. So tell the audience just a little bit about your mom and what led you to publish her book.
Well, she wrote the manuscript back in 1949 because I remember her typing it out on a good old-fashioned typewriter in London.
Mm-hmm.
And then we moved to New Zealand, nothing much happened, and then we moved to Australia. And in 1978 to 1981, she rewrote, or she added to the book quite extensively with a ghostwriter. And also I went over to France on work, so I got some information. And then she joined me, and we went up to Invergordon, which is where she came from, and then across to the East Coast. And there was a newspaper article there of when she had actually returned from escaping from France in 1941. And it was, a series of full-page newspaper articles.
Uh-huh.
And this was also added to the book. And but back in those days, it was so terribly hard to try and get anything published. So it all got forgotten about. She died in 1999, and then COVID came along 3 years ago. And I was just rummaging through stuff, and I came across a briefcase full of her manuscript. So I decided, well, I'll go and see if it's worth publishing with, the modern sort of computer type systems they have. And Ex Libris said, yes, please send us the manuscript, which I did. And it was divided into 2 sections. The first section was her being brought up in Scotland in the 1920s and having to escape from the clutches of her wicked father to France as a governess in the 1930s. And then the second genre was her actually being in the northwest of France in the 1940 to 41. The Germans came through, and she joined the French resistance, and then eventually she had to escape to get back to Scotland. So that's the basis behind everything.
Mm-hmm. And so your book, The Forbidden Zone, you have a book that was before that was published, correct?
Well, the 2 books were actually put together at the same time. So the first book is called Sprig of White Heather and the Scottish Lass, when she was being brought up in the 1920s in Gordon in Scotland, and then getting out of her clutches of her father and going to Lille in the northwest of France in the 1930s. And then that ends just as war is beginning. And then she's back in Scotland, just visiting her parents, and war is declared. And then the second part of the book, The Forbidden Zone 1940, it tells of her getting back to Lille, because back then it was the phony war. Like in September 39, the Germans actually were at war, but they weren't actually invading France until after winter. In the meantime, the British Army had joined the French Army. And one evening, she was in a motor accident, and she actually got run into by a British Army vehicle, and that's where she met Gerald, who she was later to sort of, well, she fell in love with him then, and he was around, and while the Germans were still on the other side of the border, but then he had to get back to England once the Germans crossed over and the British withdrew, and she was left stranded there. She tried to get out, but she was unsuccessful. So she just went back to managing the house, which had become a private hotel. And she was involved with the French resistance in getting all the British pilots that had been shot down and various others. They were using her house as a hideaway while they prepared to get back to England. But then after a while, she got ratted on by someone, and the Gestapo were after her, so she had to escape. So she escaped from the Forbidden Zone. Now, the Forbidden Zone was locked down more than most because that was where the Germans were preparing to invade England. So that was up in the northwest of France, and that's why it was called the Forbidden Zone. So she escaped from there into the occupied zone of France, which was the northern part of France. And then she escaped from there into the southern part of France, which was under the Vichy government, which was a puppet government of the Germans. It was a French government, but it was puppet of German. And she got down to Monte Carlo and Spain, Portugal, and she finally got back to Scotland. And then right at the end of the book, she went to London to get work and to see if she could find Gerald. And he actually was tracking her, being in the army. He's had a few contacts. And at the very end of the book, they meet up again. So the story's got a bit of everything. It's, part of the story is her upbringing, her sort of finding a new life in France and also throughout Europe. And then the second part of the story is actually in the war and the escape and all the horrendous things that happened during the war, and also the love story that intermingled with all of that.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is fascinating, just hearing you talk about it. And so when you found these manuscripts again back when during COVID and that, had you read them prior? I know you mentioned that you remember your mom writing it, but had you read them prior, or was this the first time you really read through it all?
Well, I'd read through them in 1978 to 81 because I'd sort of been looking at what she was writing and adding to with the ghostwriter, who incidentally died of radiation poisoning, which was strange because no one could work out how could he get radiation poisoning. But anyway, mystery behind the whole story. And so I knew what was going on, and I'd been up in Lille and I'd seen the Loose, which was the jail up there. Cause, it was so horrendous in winter up there. They had no food. It was freezing cold. So occasionally she would go up to a German soldier and kick him in the shin, and just to get thrown into jail where she could get a couple of days.
Oh my goodness! Yeah, wow.
So I knew all about the story before. In fact, even when she was writing it, I remember in England and later, she used to tell me about some of the horrendous things, escaping from the northwest of France down to Paris initially with the refugees, and being machine gunned and dead horses and bomb craters and you name it. So I was basically brought up with that, and my father was in the army as well. So although they didn't really talk about things in great detail, I was always sort of aware of the things that used to happen.
Yeah. And so what was that like then, being able to take those historical, her story and publish it? How did that feel for you to be able to bring that to life to share with others?
Well, she always wanted to share her story with others, but she never got the chance. So I thought, well, this is a chance, so I'll see how it goes. And that's how it went. It's out there now in various formats, and it's got hardcover, softcover, it's audio book, it's also online. And the first part of the story, that's won 4 awards. And the second part of the story, which is the Forbidden Zone 1940, That's won another 3 awards, which are
Wow.
different to the first 4. So altogether, the whole story has won 7 awards.
Wow, that's amazing. Congratulations. That's amazing. And so tell us what's maybe in either book, but what's one of your favorite stories that when you were reading through it, or even if your mom used to talk to you about it, what would you say your favorite is?
Well, probably, there's several, without sort of telling too much of the detail and spoiling the story. One was how she escaped from the Forbidden Zone into the occupied part of France, and she was basically hidden in a crate, which was surrounded by other crates full of oranges on the back of a truck. So the Germans went and they searched the truck. But of course they didn't go right down to the bottom and open up each and every crate. So that was one of the highlights. So yeah, it's suspense.
Yeah, and even like the bravery, right, to do all of these things that she did. I mean, it sounds like she was just willing to, do what it takes, and being able to, I think also for people to read that and understand that what, somebody went through, that firsthand account, right? That's so important to keep that alive for others to read or listen to and understand how it was.
Well, it was a case of escaping death. I mean, if you didn't succeed, you were dead.
Yeah.
And maybe not in a very nice way. I mean, even before, like when they had the phony war part, before the Germans came over, she actually joined the ambulance brigade with driving ambulances for the British in the north there. And on 2 occasions, the ambulance got strafed and blown up by German planes.
Wow.
So that, there was something not going on that was really ambulance. Maybe it was some other.
Yeah.
So she was lucky to sort of, not be in the ambulance at the time. So she was very lucky just to survive.
Yeah. And so what would you say some of the themes are of the book?
Well, one theme is that, she had pluck, she had courage, she was a survivor. She could sort of, manage to survive and not give up. So that was one thing. Another theme was the love in the first part, the first few months, where she and Gerald were basically, getting very, very close together before he had to disappear. And then, of course, right at the end, they came back again. Then there's the cruelty of war. You have the stories of the refugees all being machine gunned and all the rest of it. And a lot of that you sort of see happening right now in Ukraine. So, history tends to just repeat itself, and mankind tends to sort of have this vicious streak in it. So I think they're sort of the main things. You have to sort of, there are the good people and there are the not so good people, and the good people have to learn how to survive when, things go against them.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And what do you want people to know about your mom and her book, The Forbidden Zone 1940?
Well, this is a specific type of area. Like you get books on war, and it sort of might cover the whole of France or the whole of Europe or whatever and whatever. But this is specific to the Forbidden Zone. And most of the people that I've talked to, they said, what's the Forbidden Zone? What was, why did it get its name? What was so special about it? So that was a sort of a very niche area, as before, when the Germans were preparing to invade England, and they had everything locked down even more so up there. So this story is basically of how civilians were living in the Forbidden Zone basically in the middle of winter, no food, no heating. It was a very sort of austere survival. The Germans would come along and basically, just shoot people for the sake of shooting them.
Mm. And who would you say this book would appeal to, and why?
Anyone who is interested in specifics of history, like this is a specific part of the Second World War in a particular area, which is the Forbidden Zone.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone who is interested in basically a love story, because again, it started off with the two of them bumping into each other and then starting a relationship and then getting lost for a couple of years and then finding each other again.
Mm-hmm.
And also anyone who's interested in survival. People give up. They sort of think, well, they can't get there. They may as well just lie down and die. But no, if you keep going, you've got a chance.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And that inspiration behind that, right? When, sometimes we think our lives are hard, but, reading this book, I mean, we face nothing compared to what she went through with what's in the book. So Hugh, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really fascinating, really, really interesting to learn about what your mom went through, and that you took that manuscript, you brought her, she wanted it out to the world to read, and you did that. And I want to thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
And so before we close out, what do you hope readers learn or take away after reading the book?
Well, this is a story of one person, which can be reflected in so many other people.
Mm-hmm.
It's also the story of that era, that particular time in the world. And it's also a story of that particular place in the world. It's sort of very niche.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like them to sort of appreciate, sort of saying, gee, we never even knew that these stories were about.
Yeah, for sure. Well, again, Hugh, I want to thank you for joining us. You can find more about the book, The Forbidden Zone 1940, on Amazon, and I'll link to the book in the show notes, so be sure to check that out. You've been listening to the Books on Air podcast, brought to you on webtalkradio.net. You can also hear this podcast on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. I'm Sloan Fremont, and I hope you'll join us for the next Books on Air podcast. Remember, you never know who's going to be here, and you never know what we're going to talk about. Thank you so much for listening.